All right. Well, thank you very much for coming to the first big event of the Center for Brazilian Studies in the fall of 2021. It's hard to believe that time has passed so quickly, and that probably pretty soon we'll actually be able to meet together and discuss Brazil in person. But one of the things we learned from the COVID situation is how to interact with our colleagues internationally a lot better than we did before. And what this does is it means that it's possible to get information and presentations and connect up with colleagues all over the world, and particularly in the case of Brazil, with people who may not be able to travel for whatever reason. And so it's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to really begin a sort of larger collaboration between UCLA and Brazil, not just in terms of our intellectual connections, but also using technology so that we can actually interact with each other a lot more. It's my special pleasure today to introduce Ronny Rajão. I was trying to think, when did I meet Ronny? And I can't remember, of course, I
Brown.
would say.
Brown University.
It was at Brown. That's exactly right.
Yes.
I was going, but ever since then, I felt like I'd known Ronny forever. We had always been connecting and talking and so on. And so it was one of these things where you sort of have one of these friends that somehow it seems you have known them forever, and yet and that you think about them and think with them all the time, and yet it can't have been that long ago. So, but part of the reason that it feels like I've known Ronny forever is because he's such an extraordinary presence in the discussions about Amazonian development and about tropical development and writ large. And it's not just a question of looking at deforestation data and giving you a curve, but rather about thinking about it in terms of representation, in terms of science and technology studies, in terms of not just policy, but thinking about politics. Because lots of people blab on endlessly about policy as if that was the thing that ran the whole show, when in fact it really is politics. And what is so great about Ronny is that he doesn't shy away from it. Let me just give you a little background. He is, of course, he's in Belo Horizonte as we speak. He's a professor in environmental management, but also in social sciences and studies of technology. So it's not just enough to be a technology wonk. It's to think about the situation, the nature of representation, the politics of science itself, and the role of science itself. So he also teaches in the graduate programs in production and engineering and environmental analysis, but also he's very well known as a modeler, as a land use change modeler, and as what we would call a critical land use change modeler. That is, he thinks about what's going on with this. He teaches in environmental policy and economics at the University of Bonn. One of the things that many of us are noting is the powerful interest that European countries are taking in Amazonian research. I'm actually speaking to you from Switzerland, in the questions about the importance of Amazonia, because it's one of the critical 5 highly inhabited tipping points on global climate. Anyway, his research interests include spatially explicit modeling, ecological economics. He's dear to my heart in political ecology and the science policy interface, with a particular focus on climate and forest policy in Brazil. He's collaborated with, so this would already be enough to ramp up that vita into the stratosphere. But he's also worked closely with groups such as the United Nations, the World Bank, the German GTZ, the German technical cooperation. It's like the German equivalent of USAID, and has advised officials from state and federal governments in the creation of environmental policy. He has, if you look at his vita, and we're happy to post it, he also publishes in top-ranked journals, Nature, Global Environmental Politics, Global Environmental Change, PNAS, these are some of the most important ones, Science, as well as many others, Land Use Policy. So he's highly published, in fact, irritatingly highly published, if you want to know the truth. Somehow, while one is sitting there going, like changing one's commas and so on, he's actually written 4 articles. He's also an affiliated member of the Brazilian Academy of Science. So without further ado, let's listen to what he has to say, because we know that COP26 is coming up. There's many things that are hoped for. There's a lot of sort of positive happiness, and then there's also a lot of gloom. So what we do know is that Brazil went from being a climate darling to being sort of a climate pariah. So let us hear what Ronny, with his forensic analysis of a death foretold, really, of policy change, has to tell us. So Ronny, I give you the floor. I'm going to evaporate myself from the video. Boom. Okay, it's you.
Thanks a lot, Susanna, for... Yes? Can you hear me?
Yep, perfectly.
Fantastic. Thanks, Susanna, a lot for the invitation, and Brian for the support. Well, Susanna, it's also such a generous introduction. I'm really honored, and let me also take the opportunity also to tell the students that are hearing us that it's an interesting situation with you. I think that's why we kind of feel we have met each other for such a long time, because your books have been historically such an inspiration for me. And so when I met the author, and I found that the author was such a brilliant person, and then become such a good friend of mine, it has been one of the pleasures of academia. When you got to eventually hang with your idols, and so it has been really, really nice to meet you and collaborate with you. So likewise. So what I'm presenting here today, it's basically an overview of the situation of Brazil, but before actually jumping in specifically on the issue of Bolsonaro, I thought it would be very important to give a broader perspective of how things, Brazil has become this sort of climate hero in the early, especially the mid 2000s. And then how that position has basically been degrading and dissolving over time. And it was not only Bolsonaro's fault. I think that's important. So that's why it's key for us to understand the specific contribution of Bolsonaro in this tragedy foretold. So basically, first of all, it's important for us to recognize that Brazil has made tremendous advances in relation to its environmental policies. In the early 2000s, Brazil was facing more than 25,000 kilometers of deforestation in the Amazon per year. That's an absurd amount of forest going down. And basically that placed Brazil as one of the top 3 greenhouse gas emitters in the world. But since then, since the implementation of different policies that we're going to discuss here briefly, there has been a decrease of 83% in the yearly deforestation rates in the Amazon. Actually, during this period, Brazil was the single country in the whole planet that has contributed to the most for the mitigation of climate change. No other country, Europe or you name it, with all the advances in terms of energy transition, have been able to do even a small fraction what Brazil has done during this period. And how was it achieved? Well, first of all, through the strengthening of IBAMA, which is sort of Brazil's environmental protection agency, where the forest rangers work, and basically with a policy of hiring forest rangers with university degrees. So which actually GIS training. So this has been one of the main contributions of my PhD, because while different people were talking about the reductions of deforestation rates in Brazil during this period as something coming from nice policies and a stronger position from Marina Silva as Minister of Environment. I think all of those have indeed contributed. What was usually outside the picture was the role of the street level bureaucrats. You know, the guys that were actually going to the areas with deforestation, and how the fact that they have been adopting new technology enabled them to make statements about deforestation, which had a much stronger legal status because it was using satellite imagery, which, as we know, visual representation, especially scientific visual representations of the world, have that aura of objectivity. And as farmers were trying to deflect away and to avoid those fines, they couldn't really fight as effectively against a couple of satellite pictures such as these, you know, that shows his farm, his name, the situation in 2004 with the forest, and, you know, a little bit of degradation caused by selective logging, and then the situation in 2008 where it's completely clear. And so the farmer could not really say, well, the forest is still there, and the forest ranger is trying to bribe me or something like that. This was seen as a much stronger hard evidence. And indeed, together with that, you had an increase of fines and the work of law enforcement, but not any kind of fine. Actually, the overall number of fines have decreased since 2004. The difference, which is basically the orange part here, are the fines with geographic coordinates, and which have been really essential to pin down on time and space the environmental crime that has taken place. And as that crime move forward in terms of both the administrative procedures and then the civil and criminal procedures, they really gain a much stronger epistemological status. So I think this is really, really important in this. And so it also had a very substantial increase in budget with the use of helicopters, with the use of real-time monitoring systems that support special operations that would storm in and trying to find people hot-handed deforesting at that point. Also, another policy that really helped was the creation of the blacklist of municipalities. So basically, the government realized that while deforestation was taking place in a huge area, the size of Europe, most of it, more than half of it, was taking place in a handful of municipalities. So rather than trying to fight deforestation in different places, let's focus on those municipalities where most of the damage is taking place. And most importantly, let's try to impose certain restrictions, special bank credit restrictions to those areas. So basically, if you were a farmer and were trying to take your life as usual, and then your neighbor, for instance, would be deforesting, you might find yourself not being able to take a bank loan anymore. And this really made a huge difference for farmers, especially in Mato Grosso, which rely more strongly on bank loans. In addition to have this idea of naming shame situation where mayors and communities in some of those cities, they don't really see themselves as criminals. They don't see themselves even as the foresters. They always think that the neighbor, especially the people up north, are the ones really deforesting. And then when they wake up in the morning and see that the name of their municipalities is there, such as Alta Floresta, which is an interesting case, then that really had a strong impact in terms also of local articulation and action. Also, you had some interesting market actions taking place that really contributed to reducing deforestation. So, for instance, one of them has been the Soymoratoria that basically happened as a consequence of Greenpeace's advocacy that was basically showing that the soy produced in Brazil was being exported, for instance, to Europe, and that soy was feeding, for instance, the nuggets from the Mac chicken. And because of that, consumers in Europe were actually contributing to deforestation in Brazil. And there was this interesting passage where some Greenpeace activists, they're dressing as giant chickens, would chain themselves to some McDonald's restaurants in Berlin and making a fuzz around this report and these issues and calling the attention of the mass media and mobilizing attention around this. And this really, had some big effects, because I had reports from soy farmers in the Amazon around those times, and around 2007, when I was down there doing quite a lot of field work, that they were surprised because they were going to agricultural fairs in Europe, and then someone would go to them and say, "Oh, where are you from? Oh, you were from this municipality. Oh, your municipality is on the blacklist. You have been deforesting, huh? I'm not buying from you." And that was a huge shock. And that's why when Greenpeace came back and articulated with the soy producers and the big traders a Soymoratoria, basically prohibiting the acquisition and the export of soy produced in areas deforested after 2006, that was adopted by industry, because they saw that as a necessity. And it's really possible to see how that affected the land use change dynamics here. So this is basically the yearly increase in soy area. So you can see every year it has been usually coming up from 2006 to 2013. But then in 2006, about 30% of all new areas for soy expansion were actually taking place in areas that you had forest before. And this percentage has been going down and down, and now it's about 3%. So you can really see how soy farmers are spending more money to play for areas with pasture, because at the end of the day, it's a matter of economics, and then to plant soy in there rather than buying cheap forested land, and clearing then and put soy on top of that, which is a dynamic that did not take place in the same way in the Cerrado or the Mapitoba, where those restrictions did not take place. And as you can imagine, all that pressure had some results, and not necessarily positive results. While deforestation was going down, and that was good, the rural sector was really feeling under pressure here because of the economic regulation and the blacklist and the prohibition of loans in those specific municipalities. Law enforcement, so IBAMA and also the state governments really becoming stronger and more effective. Land regularization, especially the creation of protected areas. Thanks to the effort from Marina Silva, the total area of protected areas in the Amazon have increased by almost 50% in just a few years. We are talking about here the creation of protected areas on a continental scale. And of course, all of that reduces the range for the expansion of the agricultural frontier and land for speculation. And then there was a reaction of that. On the one hand, you had the reduction of deforestation rates, which was positive, the decoupling of deforestation and rural production. So you had actually seen an increase in production while deforestation was going down, especially because most of those increases were taking place in areas already cleared. And finally, you also had a growing interest in REDD, so payments for ecosystem services, carbon credits, etc. However, there has been also an interest in the environmental regularization. So, okay, so I'm wrong, I'm a wrongdoer as a farmer, so I need to get my act straight, so I need to follow the legislation. What is the legislation? So for many people, there has been a time where farmers had to face the legislation more directly, something that wasn't a big concern up to that point. And then they found, wow, the legislation here is quite strict. And not only that, I will have to reduce substantially my production area in order to comply with that legislation. So that has been actually translating in a lot of pressure in the National Congress that has led to the creation of the new forest code. And so what you see here is a process where you have a new forest code, which in practice reduced and actually gave an amnesty to 58% of all illegal deforestation taking place in Brazil prior to 2008. So, more than a half of the illegalities have simply vanished. They're not going to be enforced anymore. And we are actually seeing some of the repercussions of that. In addition to that sensation that if we organize well enough for the part of the farmers, and especially the deforesters, we can change the law, and that's a good thing. So let's not be too much concerned about the legislation anymore. You also had at the same time a gradual reduction in the budget and provided to law enforcement, and also in the reduction of the number of forest rangers working in the region. So you can see here that about around 2008, 2009 was a period where they basically did the last concurso, so the public hiring processes, and since then funding and the hiring process has been going down. Also, another point that actually we have some stronger evidence as well, and it would be interesting also to get some more detail on, is how farmers are becoming more technologically savvy. Because on the first wave, as the first wave of law enforcement came by, and when forest rangers were the first ones to really wield this strong weapon of satellite imagery and GIS and GPS and all of that, it really took the farmers by surprise, because they were somehow surprised by the fact that someone on their offices could actually watch what the farmer were doing inside their farms. And but then farmers have become more interested in this kind of technology, and also you had the diffusion of GIS knowledge related to GIS and remote sensing, etc., across the board. So, for instance, this is a small office in one of the rural cities in the Amazon, which is called Desembargo Solutions. So basically, it's a company specialized in taking out the embargoes suffered by the farmers due to their deforestation. And even they say that they can take away PRODES. PRODES is the main satellite monitoring system here, which is not really the case. They're not able to take away from the satellite. But what they can do is to basically build using on the ground pictures and older satellite imagery, etc., a legal argument that can basically question the epistemological status of PRODES as a system that can objectively produce knowledge about deforestation in the Amazon. And that sometimes, especially when judges are not very environmental friendly, which is the case quite often in the region, that can be enough, for instance, to till and to lead to a legal decision to take away and to undo the effects of the deforestation. Another thing that we have saw, which is very concerning here, is that as I was mentioning, while in the beginning, especially in 2005, 2006, we had a huge hike in the number of protected areas created in the Amazon. Since then has been an absolute reduction, and which actually coincided with the election of Dilma Rousseff. So while she was from the same Workers' Party as Lula was, it's very clear from her actions, especially in relation to the creation of protected areas, that wasn't really her main focus here, and she did not really paid a lot of attention to this agenda, and in some cases even uphold and did not sign the demarcation of indigenous lands. And of course, this really started providing a signal to farmers that if they invade the land, that might be under study for the creation of protected area, it's very likely that area is not going to be protected, and they're going to be able to grab that land and then put cattle and then sell that piece of land for a profit. And then when we have the impeachment in 2016, things really started to go from the bad to the worse very, very quickly. Because while the Workers' Party had some tensions inside its own party on its political base, really demanding them to be also environmentally friendly and protecting the rights of indigenous peoples, etc. Of course, sometimes, and well, quite often, especially under Dilma, the Workers' Party was not doing what it was supposed to do. So it was not coherent with its own discourse. But then, when you had the impeachment of Dilma and basically Michel Temer assumes, and Michel Temer is from a centrist party called MDB, who historically has been the host of congressmen linked to the ruralist movement, and some of them explicitly pro-deforestation. So the thing is, we couldn't really complain that the ruling party was doing incoherent policies, because Temer was basically doing the policies that he was requested of by its political basis. And so what you saw here, for instance, like in this situation, is this gentleman here called Flecha Ribeiro. He was the senator at that moment, who's basically is on the side of Minister Blairo Maggi, who is also the biggest soy producer in the world, and he's basically making him promise that he's going to undo a protected area called Jamanchim. And while at the same time, there is evidence that that area has been increasingly evaded by illegal ranchers, that even prior to the reduction of the protected area, they were invading and creating pasture and placing their animals inside that protected area. And so you can see it's a very difficult situation, even though it has to be said that the Minister of Environment at the time under Zequinha Sarney still kept its technical staff and was still working while slowly bleeding out, thanks to the actions that started during Dilma's government, and in some regards also were making a counterweight to the attacks coming from the other side. So you couldn't see, for instance, the Temer government making an action against the environment one day and then undoing that action the another day, so that would have that back and forth. But in any case, that would be quite negative. And all of that, still prior to the Bolsonaro government, have led to an increase between 2012 and 2018 of 72% in deforestation rates. We're still far from the deforestation observed, during the pre-Lula eras of 20,000, almost 30,000, but it's a huge jump. From 4,000 to 2018, you have double of that. You had about 8,000, but it didn't stop there. And this last bit is actually the Bolsonaro's period, and with that we are going to be talking soon. And then we have the 2018 elections, which were a very bizarre election, I have to say, because they were pretty much dominated by fake news from all sides, especially from the far right, dominated by Bolsonaro. The main piece of propaganda from Bolsonaro was a book, it's a sex education book for teenagers that he claimed that was for children of 5 years old, and that was sexualizing kids and corrupting kids' hearts, and all of that really struck a chord at the heart of Brazilians, which tend to be relatively conservative. And then on top of that, you had all these anti-workers' party, working party sentiment growing in Brazilian society in general, thanks to the huge corruption scandal that took place with Lava Jato, and which is this major investigation taking place in Brazil, which identified billions of dollars in corruption, and the media really pressed that a lot. So there was a lot of leverage on that, and then you have the situation that the Lula is still very popular, was able to place his appointee Haddad on the second round of the elections against this up-and-coming candidate called Jair Bolsonaro, which was since then only a congressman from the far right inside Congress, openly in favor of torture, openly in favor of all sorts of very peculiar policies. Let's put like that, but was representing the figure of the traditional father that would go there and spank the kid, they make him wake up and put the country on its feet. So that was the kind of image he was passing on, and many people call that. Many people accept that, especially among the evangelicals that are growing and very powerful group in Brazil. And for all candidates, environmental issues were extremely marginal, even for Marina Silva, which was the ex-minister of environment. She was fearing that if she was presenting herself as this greeny person that would not really put economic growth and social issues on the top, she would be kicked out of the elections. And so she really diminished her own role as an environmental protection person. And actually that backfired because in the end, she ended up with very, very few votes. And so Bolsonaro government was elected. And it came along with him a very peculiar set of actors. You had on the one hand, the traditional centrist ruralist group, which, by the way, Bolsonaro historically has always been linked to this centrist groups. Quite some of them, some of the parties Bolsonaro has been part of over the years have even been part of the basis of Lula's government. So in that sense, you can even be considered center-right and center-left, but Bolsonaro was always this peculiar figure, and he brought some of those old friends from politics to be part of the government. He also had the evangelical conservatives alongside with them, which were, a strong supporter of them, especially in the more on the agendas related to values and family and gender. Also, he had a neoliberal Guedes, which is a Chicago boy. He did his PhD in the 70s and pretty much wanted to do in Brazil what Pinochet and the Chicago boys did in Chile in the 70s. And then you have also Bolsonaro's sons, which are very peculiar because they brought the strand of alt-right politics that we also see in the United States. Indeed, Bolsonaro, thanks to the connections to its sons and to a character called Olavo de Carvalho, have connections, for instance, with Steve Bannon. And sometimes you see the same sort of conspiracy theories and ideas, and including in relation to the environment, such as the watermelon theory that environmentalists, they are green outside and red inside. They are form of actually trying to implement some sort of communism inside the country on the guise of the environmental agenda. This is something these guys really brought in with Bannon and with Olavo de Carvalho and all. And then finally you have this group, this military group, which is basically one of the origins of Bolsonaro, because he was a military person. He arrived to the level of captain, which is relatively low in the rank, and was expelled because he threatened to place a bomb inside different water stations in Rio de Janeiro if he didn't get a pay rise. And of course, you can imagine how much of a scandal it was. And then in the end, he was expelled on the first round of appeals and the legal process. In the second round, it was decided that he would be dishonorably discharged, but he would keep his salary anyway. And since then, he was this relatively marginal figure inside the army. But now, some of Bolsonaro's friends are old enough to become generals. And the memory of all the bad things he have done inside the institution have waned away. And some of the generals, the old generals that really, really hated Bolsonaro, are not here anymore. Most of them are dead. And so a new generation of military people actually banded together with Bolsonaro, especially because they saw in Bolsonaro the only way they could help the country to get up on its feet and get rid of corruption and all the issues, including the family and gender and values, etc., that the conservatives also share with them. And so there was this close connection between the military group and Bolsonaro. And those three groups, the ruralists linked to the centrist Congress, the centrist congressman, the military, and the alt-right. Those are the three groups that have been basically shaping Brazil's policies in relation to the environment. And then you have this interesting moments in the trajectory of Bolsonaro, because when Bolsonaro started actually putting together a team to discuss its policies towards the environment, he invited a group of military to help him out, and those militaries, by its turn, they recruited a group of scientists, actually quite good scientists, and to start shaping Bolsonaro's visions. That even though Bolsonaro would go on during the elections and say things which are very shocking from the environmental perspective, so it's not something new for him, at least there was a group inside Bolsonaro government trying to bring this idea that, for instance, environmental conservation are very important to keep ecosystem services, so the the flying rivers idea, you know, the issue that you need that green infrastructure to allow rain to pour down and help agriculture. You had this idea of the Amazon 4.0, so this idea that non-timber and biodiversity-based products with industrialization could be the future of the region in terms of wealth generation, ecotourism, that has been one of the themes. Also outside the forest sector, Bolsonaro was, and Bolsonaro's election program was talking, for instance, of green energy and windmills and solar panels. And also there was a lot of talk about the importance of agriculture modernization. So emphasizing this idea that Brazil doesn't need the forest in order to move on and to move on and actually be able to produce more food. But as you can imagine, certain things are too good to not to be true, because that was true, but to really take hold. And what happened during this process, that while the government has officially appointed a group of many very esteemed scientists and people with a background on environmental issues, as things moved on in December, the centrist politicians, especially Lorenzoni, he brought to Bolsonaro's government a very peculiar character who's called Evaristo de Miranda, who is a scientist linked to Embrapa, who's actually a very esteemed agricultural research institute linked to the Ministry for Agriculture. But Evaristo has a very peculiar profile. First of all, he's very isolated inside Embrapa as a whole, and also he tends to make some very to be very physiological in the way he makes statements and do research. Even though it's hard to call that research because he doesn't publish, he's usually only put some slides or write some newspapers articles or write opinion pieces. But he's extremely influential in this debate, especially because he has been very skillful in telling exactly what the ruralists want to hear. Although they're around, he was the one being mobilized by the ruralists to basically promote their own agenda. So to give an idea, on the early 2000s, you know, to about 2008, climate change was on the rise as an issue, and then Evaristo de Miranda was writing articles saying that his research group is ready to provide the solutions for climate change through agriculture, etc., etc. But more recently, since Bolsonaro alt-right group are also linked to climate denialism, he has been, for instance, saying on YouTube videos that climate change is fake, something made up, etc., etc. So he's that kind of character that changed very much according to the political situation. And indeed, there was an attempt to make Evaristo become the new Minister of Environment. That actually failed. So there was this internal struggle because the military group that was informed by that group of scientists really saw the kind of damage Evaristo could do. And indeed, the strange thing that the place of Minister of Environment was the last vacant ministry left in Bolsonaro government, which usually it's kind of rare. You know, usually have other ministries that would be more fight around this. And then finally, Evaristo, he indicates Ricardo Salles as Minister of Environment. And since Ricardo Salles comes with a letter of support from Brazil's Industry Association and also from Brazil's Agricultural Association, he gets the job. And so just to give an idea of who Evaristo de Miranda is, you know, he's often depicted as Bolsonaro's guru, and he's very famous for, you know, presenting some what we could call, you know, creative ways of presenting data. So for instance, there was this very set of figures where he presented the situation in Brazil to claim that Brazil has only 30% of its land used for agricultural production, while 66% are areas destined to native vegetation that are protected and preserved. And he actually places those areas dedicated to areas protected and preserved, the areas destined to legal reserves, which are areas, for instance, for logging, and also indigenous areas, which have some level of agricultural production for the use of the indigenous people. And also you have native vegetation inside those areas that could be cleared in the future. So they're not necessarily protected. So they're only there. And interestingly, he did the same figure to compare the situation with the United States. So he takes, for instance, all the pasture areas, including the native pasture areas, which in the Brazilian case, and place them as crops, basically. And most importantly, the same kind of forests that in Brazil are used for logging, he places them as agricultural use. So you can see here that the forests of the United States, according to him, they are planted forests and explored forests, which, it's completely untrue. Anyone that knows a little bit about the United States know that most of the forests in the United States, they are managed forests. They're not planted forests from scratch. And so you can see here how he uses different figures to make his point and to claim that Brazil is the most sustainable country, has the most sustainable country agriculture in the world. And there is this theory that farmers should be in the United States while forests should be here, and all of that's part of a plot to make it harder for Brazil to develop, which is something which really also strikes a strong bell strikes a strong ring on the ears of the military, which really thinks the world in terms of polarities and national interests, and so they were also eager to hear some of those arguments, part of the military. And so as a consequence of that, only 8 days from the official appointment of the group of scientists, a part of Bolsonaro's transition team, you had here all of them being sacked, and then Ricardo Salles becoming the coordinator of this group, followed by Eduardo de Miranda and Gilson Machado, who's currently the Secretary for Tourism. And so who is Ricardo Salles, who becomes the Minister of Environment since the Agro lobby wins? He's someone strongly supported by Brazil's society, rural society, which one of the oldest agricultural associations in Brazil, and in which Salles has been their lawyer and for quite some time. He also part of a far right movement in Brazil called Endireita Brazil, so written up Brazil, if you will. And he was, for instance, trying to get himself elected as a federal congressman with this kind of propaganda. So basically, against the stealing of tractors and cattle, shoot them. Against the javali, shoot them. Against the left, shoot them. Against the criminals, shoot them. So basically, that's his idea of the world. So strongly anti-NGO, anti-communist, anti-political correctness. And finally, while at first there was some hope that the military would act some sort of positivistic, science-savvy voice inside the military government, slowly some of the more prominent figures inside the Bolsonaro government, which are linked to the military, were being pushed out. So we also had this purification, this ideological purification inside Bolsonaro's government, and very, very important figures such as Santos Cruz were kicked out from the government because it was basically calling out some of the craziness that were happening inside Bolsonaro's government. And so Evaristo came up with a plan that was presented to Salles to how to solve the problems of Brazil's environment. So basically, they would create a licensing secretary linked to the presidency in order to accelerate and maybe enable more flexible issuing of licenses, including large infrastructure projects across the Amazon. Also, they would reduce drastically the number of ministries of the secretaries inside the Ministry of Environment. So with the main objective to actually weaken climate and forest policies. For instance, there was a document that they wrote almost calling climate specialists as a bunch of hippies. The language was pretty much like that. And also, they would transfer the Brazilian Forest Service, that was the being responsible for the implementation of the Forest Code, which by its turn is the main policy that is able to reduce deforestation, from the Minister of Environment to the Minister of Agriculture. Also, they have tried and still trying to merge IBAMA and ICMBio. So ICMBio is the agency responsible for enforcement inside protected areas, and IBAMA on the other areas. Also, they propose to revoke and change decrees on law enforcement with objective clearly to make it harder to issue fines. They would make it clear rules for deforestation control policies to orient forest rangers. So the idea would be to reduce the range of freedom of forest rangers. And also they would do a detailed analysis of this danger off with helicopters and other law enforcement activities, which in the end means budget cuts. And so this is the original organization of IBAMA's agenda, so organogram with the different secretaries. And those are the areas that have been destroyed and cut off by Sales/Evaristo. And interestingly, even after all that reform, most of the management positions inside the Ministry of Environment have remained vacant, and those that have been occupied have been placed by people without technical knowledge, many of them from the state police of São Paulo, especially inside IBAMA. So basically, they replaced the whole machinery, putting unapt people on top of them and expecting that, of course, that would mean the IBAMA would have less capacity. And also they have changed the legislation, as they promised, so that while prior to Bolsonaro, if a IBAMA ranger would arrive at the farm and find someone for deforestation, for instance, there would be a fine, and then the farmer would be able to provide a defense, and then there would be a decision from a trained civil servant so basically any civil servant with enough training, except the person that issued the fine, could be evaluating that first level of comparing if the defense was ground or groundless. Then the farmer could appeal again, and then there would be another decision from another trained civil servant, and then there would be a judicial execution. So they would go on court and make the farmer pay, or sometimes even take some of his assets. With Bolsonaro, there is a fine, and then after that there is a conciliatory meeting. So basically, stop everything. You come here, you the forester, let's talk. But of course, there are very few people available in IBAMA to actually sit down and talk to farmers. And basically, farmers prior to the moment where they have to sit down and talk to the forest rangers, they don't have any consequences of the fine, any consequence of the deforestation that you just did. So this was a major built-in bottleneck inside the system from IBAMA. And then you have another bottleneck that the farmer finally presents a defense, and that defense is not judged by a civil servant, is judged by a regional manager, which is a political appointee from the Minister of Environment himself. Then the farmer can appeal, and again, there was a decision, which the only person that can judge that decision is the president of IBAMA himself. So the president is judging all the processes on top of everything else he has to do. And only then things can go on judicial execution. So it's basically, this is an incompetence by design, right? It's not by accident, by design. So after all this, what could possibly go wrong, right? And these were just the first months of Bolsonaro government. So what could go wrong? Because that's why it's so much of a foretold tragedy. All the elements were there. We were expecting this, and then it came. So as when you mix up liquor and guns. So this is the situation of the number of fines issued by the IBAMA. As you can see, already in 2016, 2017. So after the impeachment, there has been a drastic reduction, and not only that, there has been a major reduction also from 2018 and then 2020. And since there was a reform of the internal procedures related to how fines are issued, you also see a huge drop from 2018, but to 2018, where the number of fines being judged yearly came from around 4,000 to basically zero or almost zero. Also, the number of fines being judged has been dropped drastically. as well as the number of personnel from Ibama, since they are increasingly retiring, get out of office. And so basically you have this lowering capacity over time. And this translates in situations such as these. So all the yellow rectangles here, those are areas that have been deforested recently, and the yellow dots are the areas with fines. So for instance, you see that this guy here has deforested, zap, there is a fine in here, but this guy, this one, there's another one, this other one, this other one, they have deforested and nothing happened. And guess what's going to happen next, right? He deforests this bit, nothing happens. Next year, he deforests a bigger bit, nothing happens. And so the sensation of impunity really plays a huge role in terms of pushing up deforestation levels in Brazil. But on top of the environmental crisis and basically fulfilling the environmental crisis, you also have an epistemic crisis. So a fight over truth, a fight over whether even this environmental crisis is taking place or not. And this has taken place, and so there was a lot of politics of post-truth politics around deforestation agenda and around the environmental agenda more in general in Brazil. And usually through different moments, you see those different steps. For instance, first, there was this idea set by the president himself, by Sales himself, and also by many of his congressmen that it's all fake. Science is wrong. Science is biased. Science and including the space scientists at IPE, at the university, they're all communists that are really mad that the right-wing conservative government has won, and they are producing fake data. So there has been this sort of argument coming up very, very strongly with strong effects all over. I had people close to me, family, friends, asking about that. So you can imagine, how deep-rooted some of those ideas are. And then you have, for instance, situations such as this, where this person, which is a congressman, who then turned against Bolsonaro, but anyway, she's still part of the group. She was basically saying that, look, how many fires have happened in 2007, 2004, etc. And actually 2018 is the minimum, with a little difference. This number of fire spots detected here was only for a few months, not for the whole year. So she was comparing a few months with 12 months and then saying, look, it's all fake because we actually have less fires than previous years. Then there is usually a second moment where they would say, oh, it's not fake, but it's actually exaggerated. It's hysterical. The numbers are there to hurt the government. And then there was a third phase that they would say, yeah, it's real, but it's natural. It's climate change. Someone else is to blame. And then there was, this idea, oh, that was not the federal government's fault. The state governments, they are to blame. They are the ones lazy. They are the ones not doing their jobs. So across the different moments, and you have seen this in 2018, you have seen this in 2020, and you have seen this in 2021 with lesser degree. You have also seen this fabricated epistemic crisis around this. Also, we have on top of that a diplomatic crisis, because as the government has evolved, well-established collaborations, for instance, with Norway, with Germany, and programs such as the Amazon Fund, they were under attack under this broader idea that those funds were a means for NGOs to either be corrupt or get money to introduce some left-wing ideologies inside towards the population, which of course there were cuts in terms of donations from those countries, and also there was which was part of the debate, this discourse, especially coming from Evaristo de Miranda, that has not disappeared since then, but he has been producing different reports and interviews and articles and YouTube videos, basically saying that, oh, Europeans, they have destroyed all their forests, so now they come to us and say that we cannot destroy ours, and actually that has led, for instance, to campaigns from the German government, basically saying that Germany today is one of the most dense forested areas in Europe, or for instance, showing that actually there are trees, right? There are trees in the United States, there are trees in Europe. It's not true that all trees have been cut down. And and also on top of that, there was this, just to tell you how complex the situation is. Macron basically became, he was the first more strongly liberal-leaning president of France for a long time, and he was actually at first a supporter for the Mercosur and Europe trade agreement. And but then, as situations moved on, especially after the Gilets jaunes, where he tried to pass an environmental legislation, a climate legislation in France, and it really backfired because people were paying a higher price to their gas, and they really revolted against the government. He said, okay, I need now to find a way to still move on to my own public of progressives, because he need the left to, in order to get reelected. And also I need to find a new nemesis. Since I defeated Le Pen on the far right in France, let's find another far right person to fight against. And he picked Bolsonaro, and actually they picked each other, because on the one hand, Macron was coming out and saying that you know, that our Amazon is on fire, and then that really helped Bolsonaro to get the strength of the military, because basically the military said, well, that's not your Amazon, it's Brazilian Amazon, it's not, you know, French Amazon, even though there's a portion there. But anyway, and then there was this interesting set of exchanges where basically a fan of Bolsonaro did this figurine showing Bolsonaro's wife, which is very young, etc., and then Macron's wife, and say, you see why Macron is so mad at you? And then Bolsonaro said, do not humiliate him, ha 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 ha. No, a president saying that of another president. And of course, you know, that was another thorn on diplomatic situation, and things have been quite complicated. And eventually also even Germany, you know, Germany is a country that historically has supported this free trade agreement, but Merkel was coming so much under fire because of her support of the agreement, which was seen as a support to Bolsonaro, that in the end she also had to drop Bolsonaro to drop the support to the agreement. Also, we have this interesting situation with the United States, right? Because Trump poses as Bolsonaro ally, and Bolsonaro really believes Trump was this big ally. And but then it's interesting to see the facts. You know, first, when there was this Brazil-France crisis, Trump basically said nothing. Then there was the fire crisis. Trump did not give a penny. Then you see how a new EU-China deal has been put in place by Trump that could basically eat up 38% of Brazil agro exports that would be transferred to the United States toward China, not Brazil. So he's basically stabbing Bolsonaro on the back all the time, while Bolsonaro quite literally came to Trump in one meeting and said, Trump, on the very little English Bolsonaro has, and said, Trump, I love you. And Trump said, yeah, yeah. Can you imagine that, right? As you know, chiefs of state. Oops. And finally, so also helping the diplomatic crisis as a consequence of all that. You had now France and Ireland threatening to not sign the agreement, and actually not threatening, but actually not signing the Mercosur agreement. Local initiatives in different countries actively asking to boycott Brazil, and also some part of the agro exporters group pressing the Brazilian government with limited success in terms of dismantling some of its policies. But then there is another key problem. As the international community and also Brazilian environmentalists have been increasingly concerned and also calling out against the issue of deforestation and the dismantling of deforestation control policies in Brazil, the Brazilian agro exports have only increased since then, since Bolsonaro was in office. If you see here the production levels in Brazil have actually increased by by more than 5% in terms of soy production between 2019 and if you consider the 18 and 19 almost by 10%. And also the exports have been following an increasing trend, thanks to growing demand from China, but not only China. Also, Europe has been buying a substantial amount of soy from Brazil. And the same thing in relation to beef. Brazil's share of beef has increased from 20 to almost to 25% globally in terms of beef exports. So that's why farmers in Brazil are pretty much very, very, very strong supporters of Bolsonaro, and they tend to come up with this view, which very much represented this advertisement from GM, where he basically shows this hardworking farmer waking up 4 in the morning, going to the newspaper stand and taking a newspaper where it's basically saying what are the limits of cattle ranching, a criticism of agricultural production, and then it basically says, yeah, well, people complain about deforestation, environmental issues. In the end of the day, those people are going to complain with their mouth full because you are the ones producing food to feed the world, and this indeed happened. That's why there is this very strong vision amongst farmers that in the end of the day, all of this environmental thing is just a mumbo jumbo. As I've heard from someone, from someone from inside the government, someone very high up. This person very high up inside the current government has told this other person that this person inside the government believes that we are living in a green bubble that's going to burst, and then people are not going to be concerned about the environment anymore. And this is from someone linked to the environmental agenda inside Bolsonaro government. And so that's why we have, some strong reasons to think the scenario is green for the environment and the economy, because of how those environmental, diplomatic, and epistemic crises overlap under Bolsonaro. You have a very pro-deforestation agro-lobby inside the government, but also amongst agricultural producers. On the other hand, Trump's defeat was crucial. Otherwise, Bolsonaro would be unstoppable. However, the same way you have in the United States that Trump lost, but Trumpism is still here. In Brazil, even following after Bolsonaro, Bolsonarism is going to still very strong. And indeed, a group of, actually the president of Brazil Soy Producers Association was actively plotting a coup d'etat against the government to put Bolsonaro as almost a dictator. You can imagine that the head of Brazil Soy Producers Association, and he actually drove a set of tractors and big trucks to Brasilia to support Bolsonaro in that. In the end, it was more of a show and more of a way to a sort of scene in order to show that Bolsonaro now has become more agreeable, and so it was part of this sort of this debate. But also there are some specks of hope, especially because the due diligence legislation being discussed now and passing on the United States, Europe, and the UK, they might help to avoid imported deforestation. However, they really require proper implementation because the due diligence procedures that are already in place, both in the United States and Europe in relation to timber, they simply don't work. And so we really need to face this and understand why that's the case, and so to not repeat the same error. Also, it's important to think that trade might be a force that changes Brazil, since boycotts have indeed proven to be more effective than democratic pressure. And this might actually start to happen in China, because there was a case of mad cow disease in Brazil, but not related to cows actually eating feed linked to other cows with mad cow, but actually it was an old age cow. So they call atypical mad cow disease. So it's not an issue, not something that should be a big concern. But China suspended the exports to the Brazilian beef imports and have not started since. Many of the countries have started buying back some of Brazilian meat, including the United States, Europe, etc., not China. And so this might be a signal that some environmental issues might be at bay here. They might start to have those issues coming in. And that's absolutely crucial, because right now, China buys more than half of all Brazil's export. Unless China is really taking environmental issues seriously, we're not going to see a major change in here. At the same time, the group of scientists, the military guys, they are still active, even though at stronger disadvantage. And even though the environmental agenda is not lost, what is most concerning here is the social environmental agenda, because you have a lot of pressure, especially in indigenous lands, and especially this attempt to co-opt certain indigenous people to make them, for instance, allow big farmers to move inside their lands. And so there was a lot of conflicts going on here. For instance, just last year, the number of during the COVID pandemic, the number of indigenous people being killed increased by 60% in relation to the previous period. And also another point of hope is that the environment is becoming central to the 2022 elections, and which Bolsonaro may actually lose. Let's see, because he's actually losing support from entrepreneurs and also part of the evangelicals. So there's a lot going on in Brazil, and let's see how things move in the future. So thanks very much. And now, I would be very happy to take some of your questions and take the debate from here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this. It's so comprehensive, I barely know what to say. What I would start with, though, just as sort of a set of questions that we might all think about, is given that next week we're going to be in COP26, and this is supposed to be the moment in which things are nailed down. How do you think Brazil's performance and also Brazil's negotiating position is going to look like? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, it's going to be hard, because international negotiations are a lot about capital, and it can be, economic capital, military power. So that's why the United States, even though was not a good boy in terms of international climate negotiations, was not behaving very well, but he never lost its clout because it's such a powerful country, economically speaking. But Brazil is now, it used to be the 7th biggest economy, actually heading up above the UK during the financial crisis, and now it's 12th, I believe. So its wealth is melting away, so his political clout is really decreasing substantially. And what brought Brazil to the table, to the negotiation table, was one, his ability to mobilize developing countries, especially through its South-South collaborations and policies, which Bolsonaro has abandoned completely. He has really turned its back to the developing countries, Africa, South America, and start focusing only into the United States as this, and especially not on the United States, on Trump, as this big speck of hope and civilization in Christianity. And also due to the environmental results of Brazil, it doesn't have the green morale, the environmental morale to tell the countries what to do, because he's not himself doing the right thing. So he's not going to have a lot of leverage. So what is left of Brazil, which is pretty much what was left of Maduro's Hugo Chavez Venezuela, is the ability to shout and to talk to its own public. So that's probably what's going to happen during the negotiations. So let's see how it goes. But I'm going to be at the COP, so I'm going to be following this and following those movements very closely from the negotiation rooms.
Will you have a blog that we can access, or are you just going to be sitting there keeping your own ideas to yourself?
Well, maybe later, maybe after the COP, I can share some of my notes and discuss that with them.
Okay, because it would be very interesting. It would be very interesting.
I have my Twitter account. I'm going to be putting in my Twitter account some thoughts, some of the things happening. But it's I'm not going to keep a more detailed blog.
Okay, well, I wish you were, but that's the way it goes. Second question, in light of the lack of, well, China is Brazil's largest trader. And as you know, there's going to be this question about the carbon footprint in global trade. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, the Chinese are very peculiar because as a diplomat who's also a friend of mine who has worked for many years in China told me, China usually don't say that they are going to do something, they just do it. Mm-hmm. And when they say that they are thinking about something, it's because they have already decided that's something that's very important. So they are very discreet. They are very low profile in terms of how they behave in this sort of international spaces. And also, since China comes from a different cultural background as the rest of the West, deforestation in the Amazon does not hit the chord as strongly as it does, let's say, in Europe. They haven't read all those novels and movies with the pristine forest. They did not believe on El Dorado and the lost paradise that might be somewhere here found in the middle of the forest. So they don't have all that cultural background. So and that's why the environmental issues, they really sound very distant to them, related to deforestation. But this might be changing slowly. And especially because they are really becoming more conscious of environmental issues at home. Also because they are very, very concerned about health, animal health and safety issues. And some of them might be linked to also environmental issues. So if China really takes up this issue more seriously and take imported deforestation as a major issue, as Europe is currently doing, we might have some major changes. But but let's see. I think China is going to do this eventually. The quick question is that whether they're going to do this in the next 3 years or the next 10 years, and that's going to make a huge difference in terms of deforestation in Brazil.
Yeah. Another set of questions is the rise of indigenous politics under the Bolsonaro regime, particularly pertaining to almost everything, but land rights, political rights, and so on. You've had manifestations. You have now a process in the Hague about indigenous genocide. Lots of how would you call them, caravanas of indigenous populations trying to mobilize international political action. So what's your sense of what's going on these days, particularly on the indigenous front?
Yeah, so there was this, there was indeed a lot of a substantial increase in the politicization of indigenous issues on both grounds. And I think first, let's say the more environmental friendly fringe of the indigenous movement has gained a lot of voice, and they also started exposing themselves more strongly, mostly because some of their friends and family were being threatened, shot at, and sometimes killed. So there was a matter of survival for quite a few of them. But on the other hand, Bolsonaro and some politicians, they also struck a chord inside part of the indigenous community, because you have some indigenous groups that, for instance, would like to do more farming. Some of them would even like to do more gold mining, and they were, somehow muffled in the debates. And now Bolsonaro has taken those that are probably a minority, and have taken them and said, look, these are the real indigenous. They want to be developed. They want to farm their land. They want to be like the North American Indians. They are rich with all the casinos and things like that. So there was this. There was an increasing level of division inside the indigenous communities as well. So at the same time, they have gained more articulation, and they have become stronger and a stronger political voice, and many young activists, coming from the indigenous groups. So that's very positive. also there was a strong, a growing division inside the communities themselves.
What about the former, what we might call Forest People's Alliance? And also, what about, at this juncture, the demonization of international environmental groups as kind of, how shall we say, promoters of sedition? How is that working out? Because, of course, the shift, there's been a very pronounced shift from national funding of NGOs into international funding. And of course, Bolsonaro has cut off so much. So what's your sense of what's going on in terms of that?
Well, things have been worse at some point, especially under...
I suppose that's a comfort.
Yeah, well, it's because we have to remember that when Ernesto, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, was there, and he's a strong Olavista. You know, he has been writing that, you know, climate change as well as COVID is a Chinese invention and things like that. And at the same time, you had also Sales that was very, you know, very confrontational, very aggressive, because also was for Sales a political strategy. Sales has ambitions to become a big right-wing politician, and so for him, the more attention he gets, even if it's bad attention, bad publicity is better than no publicity. So he was always, you know, creating waves around those issues. And now we have a Minister of Environment, which is pretty much doing the same policies that his president was, but he's very discreet, which is Joaquim Leite. And also we have also the same thing in the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And finally, we had Vice President Mourão, who became the president of the Amazon Commission, which had actually very little effect in terms of reducing deforestation, but at least he kind of normalized some of the relationships, because, you know, Mourão is more of a gentleman type of guy. He sits down and talks, and he's more moderate. And I think that helped to contain some of the damage, not all of the damage, because I think it's going to take, you know, decades for Brazil to regain its the trust amongst its allies due to all the bad things that have happened in the meantime. But at least it contained some of those damages. And now, in relation to the public perspectives on those issues, yeah, one of the bad things during this period that there was, you know, this overall demonization of NGOs. Bolsonaro convinced, you know, half of the Brazilian population that the ones putting fire on the Amazon weren't the farmers wanting to expand their lands, but were the NGOs themselves that want to get funding. And it may sound absurd, right? Can you imagine an NGO, an environmentalist, putting fire just to take a picture of the fire and then get the money? But actually, I had people from my own family coming to me and asking those things. You know, people well educated, and so I think that's probably the thing also we have been facing. You have been facing with Trump in the United States. You know, sometimes you have something which can be as crazy as it is, but it comes out with and it strikes such a chord inside that bubble, which is a pretty big bubble. You know, almost half of the population. Then it becomes, you know, somehow true for that group of people, and so it's going to take some time, you know, for all this epistemological damage to get solved, because since you have the situation where, you know, a esteemed physicist, a PhD from, you know, very famous universities worldwide, president of the Brazilian Institute of Space Research, saying the situation is X. And then you have someone on the WhatsApp say, no, he's telling a lie. This is all, you know, conspiracy, etc. And people believe that. And so it's going to take a long time to actually rebuild trust on institutions and rebuild trust on let alone civil society.
Yes, we are all facing kind of a similar set of questions. Do you think the recent indictment that just came out through the Brazilian Congress after the investigation of Bolsonaro's comportment on the COVID question is going to have some major effect on both his capacity to, how shall we say, govern, and also the capacity of the state more generally to enact its governance more broadly, like on anything? Or is it going to be a kind of paralyzed state sitting and fighting within with its political classes?
It's difficult to tell because in the end of the day, what the COVID investigation has provided to the opposition and to certain groups, including Brazilian High Court, is a gun, right? And as any gun, it could be used or not used. It could be kept in a safe. It could be used to shoot down someone's electoral eligibility chances. So it's going to depend a lot on how things move on. And interestingly, Bolsonaro has noticed that. And for instance, there was this recent interview with a ex-volleyball player from Brazil, a gold medalist, etc. And she was basically saying to Bolsonaro that, oh, the High Court minister has issued an order to arrest this journalist, who is, one of the fake news producer journalists, which actually now in the United States. And so it's basically an Interpol action taking place to extradite that guy. And then Bolsonaro said, basically almost shamingly said, no, actually it was the federal police that asked the guy to be arrested. It wasn't the High Court minister. If it was, a few months ago, when the fight between the institutions were very heated, he would have certainly put even more fire on this. But now he has certainly done a gentleman's agreement with the High Court, and to lower the temperature, and which basically means that the High Court and does not have a reason right now to use that gun. But as soon as he moves on, things might change. But I wouldn't say that you have any deterministic consequences of the COVID investigation coming after this.
I'm going to read a couple of things that are coming in from the chat. One is from Lee Mackey. Hi, Lee. His question is, looking forward, are there shifts in power of different groups in the Bolsonaro movement? And what might the implications be for environmental policy, COP negotiations, positions, etc., especially in the context of next election, threats to Bolsonaro from the judiciary, and the low public opinion polls for Bolsonaro?
Yeah, there has been some shifts, especially the more Bannon-related alt-right groups have become less powerful. Also, the military have become a lot less powerful inside Bolsonaro. So only the military personnel that was more strongly linked to Bolsonaro's ideology have remained in government. So they basically have been co-opted to a large degree. And so there is now more criticism also inside the military than there was in the beginning of Bolsonaro's government. The evangelicals also are losing some support to Bolsonaro, but on the other hand, the agribusiness, especially the ruralists more linked to issues around deforestation, are as strongly supporters to Bolsonaro as ever. And so they have also gained a stronger role inside Bolsonaro's government and the shift of power. But it's difficult to imagine, especially during the COP, how worse could Brazil really do in the COP, thanks to those pressures. And at the same time, in Congress, you had some actions, quite negative actions taking place, but some of the worst things that were coming up were actually diffused, or they were avoided at first due to the actions from the president of the lower house, Rodrigo Maia, who helped to withdraw and withhold some of the more damaging environmental legislations. And now you had at the Brazilian Senate a more important role of Pacheco, and also Senator Cachabreu, who has now, which is a historical, very strong supporter of the ruralist agenda, but she has now a more moderate position on those issues, and might be also be playing an important role in moderating some of those pressures. So I wouldn't say that it would depend, because that's the thing, right? Things change very, very quickly. Now, during to the COP, some of the worst things in Congress have been slowed down, but just after the COP, you might see acceleration of that. So things really change by the day, by the week. And that's why my life has become, hell, because I'm there, living my life, writing my papers or trying to, and then suddenly new law proposal, Professor Rajão, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm going to Brasilia, and then taking part in hearings, them and helping, different people to write proposals. And so it's, it's very unpredictable. So I'm living by day here. It's really hard.
I have another comment and question from the chat. And this argues, first of all, thanks you for your presentation. What's the relationship between Bolsonaro's water privatization policy and deforestation? And this is from Peter Reich in the UCLA School of Law.
It's a good question. I haven't really considered that yet. Also because so far those agendas, they live quite separate. But it's certainly part of this broader movement of neoliberalization that Bolsonaro is bringing to the government and to Paulo Guedes, even though they're not very consistent in that. For instance, right now, Paulo Guedes is basically trying to privatize and spend extra money and go above the budgetary limits in order to pay for basically to pay up for Bolsonaro's re-elections, giving money to both the people that need it, which are right now we have a major economic crisis hitting especially the poor, so they need the money, but also he wants to keep giving the money to congressmen to build bridges and do building works in their constabulary areas in order to earn votes. So he's basically not wanting to trade one thing to the other, and that's not a very austerity-like or neoliberal-like thing to do. But then it's difficult to tell how those things are directly connected. I wouldn't see them as being connected right
now. I have a question which has to do with the larger trajectory of Brazilian science. One is this, which is Brazil was sort of, how shall we say, a modernist state that was interested in the expansion of knowledge as a means of governing and understanding its complex world. A couple of days ago, it just cut the CNPq, basically the research budgets of the country by 92%. So while if you are getting international funding, it might be okay. What do you think is the larger implications of this? And thinking about Brazil, which has been so innovative in so many ways, whether it's from flex cars and GMOs, way we hate them, but still, it has had a very interesting sort of modernization, innovation track, but you can't do that without supporting science and universities and thinking about things in complex ways. What do you think the deal is going to be? What is your sense of this?
Yeah.
Is this just austerity ... or a deeper anti-science dynamic within the processes of governance?
I think we are living in a deeper anti-science movement, and increasingly you have this idea across the population in Brazil that universities are, basically a bunch of communists doing nothing all day and with useless research, and which actually comes along at the same time with a very pro-science perspective. So Brazilians in general, they don't really have those sort of risk society mood that they fear innovation. They are quite pretty much pro innovation and technological change, but they don't see the Brazilian universities and research centers as being the source of that. You know, there's this pretty much, oh, okay, MIT is this, you know, very technical with no ideology at all, and everything that happens there is great. But the Brazil, nothing happens here, nothing is good. Everything's very ideological. They have this funny, you know, dichotomy where they really throw out Brazilian knowledge, and that's why there was this, you know, just a little funny moment here. I was having this conversation with an entrepreneur. You know, this lady, she actually was the head of a large company in Brazil, in the cosmetic sector. And then at some point she comes to me and said, "Oh, you know what? I would never let my son go and study in a public university in Brazil, because, you know, it's all those bad things and drugs and orgies, etc." And she knew I was a professor, right? And then I came to her and said, "Oh, so I think there's probably something wrong with me. I must be too ugly. I never been invited to an orgy. So, you know, I have to maybe dress better, or, you know, it's my haircut or something like this." And so it's, of course, I had to come back with a lot of irony, but it's, if someone like that comes to you and say that those things on your face, so there's certainly some much deeper issues there, and it's a long process, you know, to rehabilitate that. And I think this is actually linked to how universities have become such a politicized place in an agenda around, you know, minority rights and LGBT and gender and freedom, and so Brazilians, who are in general quite conservative, they really made up their minds in relation to university in a specific way. And so that's why universities are dying in terms of research funds, and it's not really causing such a big fuss. And at the same time, on the inside the universities, we are so much concerned about the risk of losing our freedom, our academic freedom. You know, it's in many universities across the country, Bolsonaro has actually replaced the rectors that have been the chancellors that have been elected by the community by people from their own choices that, of course, would implement specific policies inside the university. And also the university are really in the self-defense mode. You know, let's you know, not make too much of a fuss, and let's try to at least keep the leader we have. Because, you know, there are bigger threats out there, especially in terms of losing our academic independence. So this is pretty much the mood, I would say.
Boy, well, it's a shame, because, as you know, as we all know, Brazilian science, Brazilian history, Brazilian analytics on multiple dimensions has been at the forefront of rethinking so many paradigms that it's the sort of shrugging off of its heritage is kind of disconcerting.
Yeah, it is.
Let's see what else we've got going here. Otherwise, hold on. Anyway, why this has been an incredibly interesting and complex set of issues. Brian, do you want to leap in and say a few things about the center and other things that are upcoming? Also about keeping your eye on our Facebook page and so on. I leave you to do some
absolutely
some propaganda here.
First of all, thank you so much for joining us today, Ronny. We're very pleased to have you with us. So we do have coming up, our next event for the Center for Brazilian Studies is coming up on Friday, November 19th, I believe at noon Pacific time. You can find more information on our Facebook, facebook.com/UCLA-LAI, or also on our website, international.ucla.edu/LAI. It's going to be a roundtable on COVID-19 and the toll of COVID-19 in Bolsonaro's Brazil, the human toll of climate denialism. And it's going to feature Professor Karen Nielsen from the medical school right here at UCLA, who herself is Brazilian. It's going to feature Maria Amelia Veras, who is a public health specialist from Brazil, and Brian Meir, an American journalist who has lived in Brazil for the last 25 years. It's part 3 in an ongoing series we've had with these panelists to discuss sort of the evolving situation of the pandemic in Brazil. If you check out our webpage for the Latin American Institute or our Facebook page, you'll see that we have events. We have a current speaker series on Colombia that's going on. We have 2 events coming up evaluating the presidency of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, and a variety of other events from pretty much every sub-region and country in Latin America. Susanna, I want to hand it back to you so you can close us out.
Well, first of all, thanks so much. I think that what Ronny has shown us is that the situation is a lot more complex than it was just Bolsonaro. Of course, in our hearts, we would like to think that, but it is a much more complex situation. The other thing is that there's a lot of geopolitics in this. There's a lot of the dynamics of right-wing, the right-wing and left-wing questions about fake news and the larger politicization of forms of knowledge. And then all of this is taking place within a context of an ecological tipping point, which if we don't do something about it, portends an unpleasant future for us all, even though it may seem so distant and may seem so abstract, but yet its transformation is one of the ones that is the most critical. It's considered one of the 5 top tipping points. The other ones are the Arctic, Greenland ice shield, a couple of ocean currents, and Greenland, but this is the only place that is inhabited by lots of people, over 30 to 35, and Pan-Amazonia itself, about 35 million people. So in a certain sense, while we can't do too much about the carbon that was spewed in the 1950s or before now, the land use change that we're seeing now, which, was so beautifully explained, is one of the key tipping points now, not just for Amazonia, but for the global context. So as you can see, it's not just flipping a switch. It's going to be a lot more complicated. The other thing is, I think that this is particularly important, given that COP is coming up next week, the committee, where it is said, this is our, code red for humanity. So in this context, the Amazonian dynamics are of particular importance. So I thank Ronny. I'm going to give a and for taking the time to illuminate us. Brian, have you anything
Thank you all
else?
very much.
Well, we're so delighted.
There is someone on Twitter asking whether this is going to be recorded somewhere.
Yes, the event has been recorded. If you go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/UCLA-LAI, it should be available right now as soon as the event is over to watch the whole video. It'll also be available on our YouTube channel, which is also UCLA-LAI.
So yeah, cool. UCLA, LAI. Fantastic.
It'll never go away. It'll follow you forever. You'll never,
Fantastic.
if eons from now, aliens will come. All right, you all.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Please follow us on social media, keep up with our upcoming events, and have a great rest of your afternoon and weekend.
And keep looking at our Facebook, because we post stuff all the time.